and then you can get underway. Thank you very much. So excited to have you.
O tēnā rā koutou, he mihi nui ki a koutou kua tae mai ki te whakarongo I tēnei ahiahi. He mihi nui hoki ki a koe Kāinga mō tō tono ki a māua ki te kōrero ki a koutou. So tēnā koutou. Just before we start, you may see on our title slide an image. That image was done by one of our summer scholarship students. We sort of said to them, you know, you can do what you like. It can be a creative piece, or it can be a more sort of traditional historical study. So he did two images for us. So yeah, we were really pleased with that, plus a little bit of sort of exegesis on how he went about it.
His name's Jordan Cornell. He's a fabulous young up-and-coming Māori artist.
Yeah.
And as we'll explain a little bit later, our project has supported a whole range of Māori summer scholarships, about 9 so far, and Jordan was one of them from our first year.
Okay. So the dominant narrative around Māori and World War II, even from the time of the war, has been around the 28th Māori Battalion and their service overseas in Greece, Crete, North Africa, and Italy. Almost 3,600 served overseas, 649 of whom were killed or died on active service, 1,712 wounded, and 237 captured. As General Freiberg, the New Zealand commander, stated, no infantry battalion had a more distinguished record or saw more fighting, or alas, had such heavy casualties as the Māori battalion. So this war service was and continues to be a source of pride for Māori. One of the most enthusiastic recruiters was the long-serving politician Sir Aotearoa Ngata, who saw the Māori sacrifice as the price for citizenship. That is, that Māori would buy political equality and the respect of Pākehā through the blood of their young men. So while we are in no way wanting to minimize this overseas war story, our project is focused on the majority of the Māori population that remained at home. Because the war experience at home and abroad was so significant to the post-war period, our project also includes the rest of the 1940s, which, apart from the war, is a largely forgotten decade in New Zealand historiography. So we've been working on Te Hau Kāinga for about 2 years now, and we've been collecting as much material as we can. We've got some great RAs working for us. And we've been communicating our work through our fully bilingual website, and we welcome any and all interested viewers. So please feel free to have a look. As you can imagine, the project scope is potentially extremely broad, and we're not likely to cover everything. But what we've been doing as we've gone along is to post short kōrero or stories onto our website. And these cover Māori economic activity, their contribution in uniform at home, such as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps or the Home Guards, social change, Māori politics, and other topics. So what you see there is just a few of our stories. Andrew and I have provided many of these kōrero, but we've also encouraged our postgrad students, our research assistants, and our Māori summer scholarship students to write up research for the site. But before we go on to the few topics for this seminar, Angela will talk a little bit more about what the project's about.
Okay, thanks, Lockie. So as you can see from the images there, you can go back there, Lockie. Thanks, Lottie. We have been working on a range of elements relating to the project. And so the project is extremely broad in scope. It's broadened out as we've been working on it, really, hasn't it? As our summer scholarship students, as I mentioned earlier, we've had 9 Māori students have really started to really broaden out the scope of our project. Without them, we wouldn't have thought about things like hockey or many other elements of the project that they've really explored. Another project that a recent student did was on Māori university students in the 40s at our many universities here in New Zealand. And no one's done any work at all in New Zealand on the story of Indigenous engagement in the university sector prior, to, during the 40s and afterwards, really. A lot of works on Aotearoa Ngata and others, the early pioneering figures. So as Lockie has noted, our project is large in scope, but its central focus is the story of the Māori experience of the war at home for whānau and communities. And that's another reason why many of our summer scholarship students are so important, because they do that kind of home-based work. This includes continued actions for justice and retention of land through to engagement in unions, through to access to rehabilitation for ex-servicemen and women. And I've been doing a little bit of work on that more recently. Now, our understanding of the Second World War, its course and its consequences, argue Kariana Pinell and Daniel Todman, is derived from the timing of military engagements and campaigns, battlefield defeats and victories, and the great strategic conferences. And is, as Yasmin Khan has pointed out relatively recently, largely European in focus. And her work on India has been particularly important in terms of the story of the home front and kind of broadening our understanding of it. And she's noted how we still know very little about the after effects of wartime and demobilisation on women in Asia and Africa. And I think we can add the story of the Pacific into that as well, and particularly the story of Indigenous peoples in the Pacific. Histories of World War II with Indigenous peoples at the centre are particularly rare. And I can see people on the screen in front of me who've done a lot of really important work in that space. And Australian historians have shown what is possible when we do place Indigenous, usually men, at the heart of the war effort. But the focus is largely still on military service, and that's really important. It's an important part of the story. And the home front, though, has not necessarily been a kind of core component of the scholarship. So moving our focus to other kinds of mobilisations is required if we are to centre Indigenous experiences of World War II. While men and women served overseas or in uniform at home or in the industrial war effort, the Kāinga, the home communities, continue to fight for redress from colonial wars, notably land confiscations, I'll mention a little bit later. Political mobilisation continued at pace, and religious mobilisations did not stop either, and Lockie's going to talk a bit about that very soon. And I really want to note here that one of the kind of key figures, that, the work of Melissa Matutena-Williams has been really important to us. Her work on Māori urban migration from a small northern community in New Zealand into Auckland has really touched a little bit on the war itself. And she says in that book that the impact of Māori participation in World War II is one of the most insidious and least understood changes in Māori society and our history. It's something that's constantly passed over. And in the scholarship in New Zealand, the post-war story begins in 1945. It should begin in 1939, as far as I'm concerned, or even 1930. And the story of the war is always something that happens overseas, not necessarily something that happens here for Māori, here in Aotearoa. So what we're trying to do is kind of play around with that and bring the war home and to figure out what Māori are doing at home in order we can stretch our understanding of what war service is and what the price of citizenship looked like for men and women at home, because that notion of the price of citizenship was so critical to, and still remains quite critical in the framing of the Māori war effort here in New Zealand, including in the relatively newly established 28th Māori Battalion Museum up at Waitangi too. So we are responding really to Melissa's sentiment and call for new ideas here in our project. And so what Lockie's going to talk about now is a bit about those religious mobilisations.
Okay. So it's quite a dominant feature of New Zealand historiography that history is essentially secular. And the 1940s histories are no exception. But if we look at the censuses that bookend the war years, we can see that most Māori profess a religion. And though there are 3 Māori faiths identified, they're the ones that are in pink, which made up about 1/4 of the population, most Māori belonged to a missionary church, i.e. the ones that are in blue. And to get an idea of a comparison with the Pākehā population, you can see, or the non-Māori population, you can see that on the right. So mission NOD is just where a person hasn't distinguished a particular mission. They've just written mission down. The concept of mission was still firmly embedded in the churches of that time. So that was Māori mission, home mission, and foreign mission. So each of the other religions, the ones in darker blue, ran a Māori mission, sometimes by diocese, sometimes nationally, with Māori mission stations plopped around the country. So I need to explain that some of the missions ran schools and some missionaries adopted a few children, but missions did not have any general coercive powers over Māori families, nor did they try to corral them onto a mission station. If Māori ever felt compelled to belong to a particular denomination, it would have been due to peer pressure from within their own communities. So a mission station was generally just a house and a church. And the missionaries spent a lot of their time going out to visit families who lived completely independently. Although the mission sat under Pākehā control, the Church of England had a Māori bishop, and its mission had some Māori clergy. The clergy on the ground for the Methodist Māori mission were all Māori, as were some of their deaconesses. The Presbyterians had several Māori ministers, although one volunteered pretty quickly for the war. Quite upset his administration. And the Catholics ordained a Māori priest during the war years. Māori lay readers and catechists were also very important to the viability of these churches within Māoridom. Now, although churches often talked about Pākehā and Māori worshipping together, and this did happen to a limited extent, most Māori still lived rurally within their own communities, sometimes, though, quite close to Pākehā towns. But services were often in Māori language, as many older Māori were not comfortable with English, and Māori themselves liked having their own churches. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that Māori engagement with mission was very different to that of many Australian Aborigines. But religion is a very important factor when looking at Māori life in the 1940s. So how do we find the voices of Māori that reflected their experiences and thoughts? We can find traces of what was going on in the periodicals produced for the mainly Pākehā adherents. But these are often quite brief. So, for example, the one at the top, it's an Anglican service, which is attracting both Māori and Pākehā together. Or if we can see the Methodist one on the deaconess, they tend to accentuate a generic missionary experience over that of their Māori communities. But if we look at that, we can glean some information, for example, that a lot of the interaction with Māori was about Sunday schools, and that the Methodist deaconess used tangi, which is Māori funerals, to gather in children. But we don't know who the deaconess is, whether she's Māori or Pākehā, or even where these tangi took place. Some of the missions produced their own periodicals for Māori, such as Te Waka o Hatupetara, put out by the Mill Hill Fathers for the Māori Catholics of the Upper North Island. Now, this magazine it was amazing. I read through it, and it didn't mention the war really at all. Didn't really talk much about how Māori were coping or carrying on. There was a lot of church history and discussion about the fathers themselves. And any discussion of the communities is really through their interaction with the priests, such as retreats and catechist training. But you do find a few things, such as this letter from Tamati Tawhiao on the ordination of several Māori nuns. So the church had started a novitiate
Don't ask me.
in 1935 for a specifically Māori order, the Sisters of Mary in Waitaruke, which is a remote village in Northland. Now, these nuns mainly just prayed and did manual work, and they were not allowed to have much contact with their families or even with the community. But this letter from this Māori man is very upbeat, and he views the idea of Māori nuns very positively. Unsurprisingly, perhaps few Māori women felt the calling, and few could actually keep up what was, in the end, a very dreary existence. And the order ended up closing in 1952. They had 7 nuns left over who ended up joining the Marist sisters. Okay, this periodical here is the official newspaper of the Ratana Church, Te Whetū Marama o Te Kotaitanga. Unfortunately, not all the issues from the war years are in the archives. I haven't found them yet. But from those that are there, it appears it mainly focused on aspects of church dogma, reports on meetings, such as this one, which is about the gathering to celebrate the birthday of the prophet T.W. Ratana, who had died 2 years earlier. So his birthday is still an important event, both nationally and within the church. So the first day of that particular hui each year, all the politicians arrive from all the different parties and try and attract Māori votes. But while we can get an idea of some church activities from this new paper, we don't get much sense of the day-to-day life or what it was like for ordinary Ratana adherents. So the Presbyterian Te Waka Kraitiana is a little more revealing about Māori life and activity. And in this particular article reports on a gathering at Maunga Puatu, where the church had a mission station and a school for the Tūhoe people. This was a very remote locality and very rugged terrain in the middle of dense bush. And it didn't have a road to the settlement. But this hui had a number of purposes, one being the opening of a new meeting house. The head of the Maori Mission, the missionary Reverend John Lawton, attended, and while he was there, conducted 2 marriage ceremonies. What's not said in here, although everyone reading it would have understood, is that Maunga Puatu had been the village of the prophet Ruakenana, who had founded the Iharaira faith, which was an offshoot of the Ringatu religion. And the village had been the scene of a police invasion in 1916. Now, the Presbyterians, of course, were attempting to convert Tūhoe, but they also maintained a peaceful coexistence with the Māori prophetic religions. The Iharaira was suspicious of Pākehā paperwork, so they were happy for the Presbyterians to perform ceremonies, such as marriages, that required government forms. The article also references Māori culture, as in the day that the house was newly opened was a time when the remnants of the village all came together, returning from the 4 winds to cry to the marae, the house, and the mountain. We learned too that 2 deceased chiefs returned to be buried with their ancestors. The circumstances are a little unclear. The article states they were lifted and returned as bones, which suggests a traditional placing of the body in a cave or similar for the flesh to rot off, so that the bones may be scraped and then finally buried. What is clear is that despite the missionary presence, and this is in a missionary periodical, this is still very much a Māori event. Now, Te Waka Kaitiana did mention the war a lot, often in a religious context, but the war was an event that was happening far away. Of course, it impacted on these people, but in many ways, life went on as normal. One of our best church sources is Te Karere, the Mormon periodical. Te Karere started out in 1907 as a purely Māori language magazine, but by the 1940s had more English content than Māori. So, although the Mormons made up only about 6.5% of the Māori population, Māori made up almost 90% of the church, with the very relatively few Pākehā adherents living in the cities. Most of the Māori lived in their own villages or settlements, although not normally as remotely as the Tūhoe. The church portrayed itself as modern and progressive. It had a very American flavour, but due to its demographic nature, it was also a very Māori church. And when all the American missionaries, except for Matthew Cowley, the mission head and his wife, returned to the USA in late 1940, it fell on Māori to take up much of the work that they'd been doing. So in that box, Cowley and his family. So all of the mission churches tried to get their adherents into a wide variety of church organizations, and the Mormons were probably the most successful. Once you were a Latter-day Saint, you were expected to participate whatever your age and gender. But in communities with little other entertainment, people were generally happy to be involved. So this particular report here is on the Hauraki parish meeting. And they're saying this is the first one that they've had since the American missionaries left. And it's a 2-day affair which attracts members from other areas as well. And we learned that the youth wings put on Māori cultural performances and also a play about the evils of alcohol and nicotine. But perhaps the most valuable section is the news from the field, in which branches wrote in short reports of their news. These were Māori writing about other Māori in the church. And what it shows is that people were trying to follow normal routines as much as possible. So on the left there, we see that the Nuhaka people of Mahia are preparing their marae for the hui tau. So this is the big annual gathering for all the Mormons in the country to come together. Others are looking at making their branches more successful. It's not that the war was totally absent from people's minds. Te Karere sometimes published news of members who had been killed or captured, and the members farewelled and then welcomed back their boys. They also raised funds for patriotic causes, with branches using their annual balls and their queen contests to raise money. Matthew Cowley, the head of the mission, also saw the war as a way to normalize the church through patriotic activity. So the hui tau of 1943 was such an opportunity. As we can see in these before and after comments from Cowley, using the fundraising techniques used within their normal activities, they were able to make a lot of money. Over 2,000 people attended, many of them non-Mormons, who enjoyed the Māori cultural performances and hospitality and learned about Mormon belief and practices. This hui tau raised £13,000, which is almost $1.2 million in today's terms, for the war effort, 8,000 of which came from their Queen Carnival competition. So now, what we're going to do is hand over to Angela.
Thanks, Lockie. So as you can see, we're trying to work through a whole range of religious periodicals to kind of explore the question of religion in Māori life during the 1940s, both as a kind of support for communities who are waiting for their young men to come home or for news about them, but also in terms of their kind of community involvement and their patriotic effort. There's a whole range of kind of experiences coming through those periodicals. And I think what's really critical, I think, is that the Mormon magazine, I think, has probably been the most valuable for us so far. And Lockie could probably talk a little bit about that, I think, at the end, because it is really such a community-orientated magazine. And I think that says something about the nature of the Mormon church and how it operates within Māori communities too. And the Mormons have been somewhat overlooked in New Zealand's history. Would you agree, Lockie, around that? Yeah.
Yes.
I think particularly because it is such a Māori church, especially. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of petitions and protest. And so Lockie's talked here about religion and some of the source materials we have available for that. Petitions are another overlooked area in New Zealand history, but where Māori are particularly active during the 1940s in sending petitions to the Crown and seeking redress for historic injustices. So while Māori were serving overseas for the price of citizenship, at home their whānau was seeking redress for past injustices and trying to prevent further injustices arising. Petitions to the government demonstrate the range of collective mobilizations taking place in those communities, from the very local to the very national in scope, and also quite global too. Ones like this you see on the screen that relates to what's happening overseas during wartime. The Native Affairs, later Māori Affairs Committee, heard 176 petitions between 1940 and 46, the majority collective and most relating to land. A number focused on seeking justice for the confiscations enacted against the so-called rebel tribes who took up arms against the Crown in the 1860s, and also just other kinds of dispositions taking place through land purchases and sales, often done in very corrupt ways. Others wanted their fishing rights secured, and there were large collective petitions from people or groups such as the Rātana Church. Rātana had been petitioning the government since the 1920s, and two large, very large, I think with 45,000 signatures on it, came from the Rātana Church seeking recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1943 and 1945. So there's quite a lot of dynamic activity going on, both in terms of church life, but also in terms of political life in Māori communities as well. During war, petitionary protest did not stop. In fact, the war was a catalyst for action, such as with petition number 66/1945, for action from, I think it is Panita Maniopoto Otini and 10 others, praying for the return from the Vienna Museum of a collection of Māori relics unlawfully removed from the King Country. They requested the return of tipuna, or ancestral remains, taken by the Austrian naturalist Andreas Reichek in the 1880s. Basically, grave robbed a whole bunch of sacred locations in the King Country territory. And these were then taken overseas and given to the Imperial Natural History Museum in Vienna. And they asked, now that Vienna has fallen, we, your petitioners, humbly pray that your honourable house will take steps to have restitution made on behalf of the Māori people by taking steps to have the whole of the collection herein returned to the Dominion of New Zealand. It's really difficult, I'm trying to trace what happened here, but it's difficult to trace exactly what the response was to this. But it appears little did happen, because the first instance that I can find of any formal response from the government is when the Māori Queen negotiated the return of some remains from Vienna in 1985, followed by another negotiation of return of remains in 2015 that went to Papa. So that collection, I think, is still partially probably in Vienna. So there's a long-term trajectory and legacy here that emerges out of the war in a global sense. And then the other petition I really want to talk about is Orake in 1943. This was a national petition begun in December of 1942, and it was a collaboration between Māori and Pākehā, notably Te Puea Hirangi, one of the key leaders of the pan-tribal kingitanga movement that had been established in 1858 to prevent land sales and dispossession. So the kingitanga are particularly active in the 1940s. And Ōrākei, I should point out, is in not in kingitanga territory, but in Ngāti Whātua territory. But we can explain Te Puea's involvement from traditional tribal allegiances between Waikato people and Ngāti Whātua that go right back to the 19th century. And during the war, Ōrākei was a central location for new migrants coming to Auckland City to work in essential industry, young Māori coming into the city. It's located, if anyone knows Auckland very well, you might have heard of Bastion Point or Kahu Bay, Ōrākei. They're all in similar locations. They're related to each other, and they're on the edge of central Auckland, basically. So located at Kahu Bay, Ōrākei is slowly being whittled away by the Crown until only a few acres remain, and this is indicated in the petition that you'll see on the next slide. And this was not the first time the community had petitioned for the return of their ancestral land, nor pressed for improvements to their community. Proposal to evict the community and demolish the settlement had begun in the 1930s. Now, Te Puea stepped in on behalf of her people in 1940, visiting Ōrākei that year. She formed the Ōrākei Petition Committee in 1942, and she collaborated with the General Labourers Union and the Auckland Trades Council on a petition presented to government in February 1943. It was in fact 4 petitions. One of the largest was this one here you see in the image, which was Te Puea's petition with over 3,000 signatures. We're in the process of transcribing it, trying to get all the names. So the whole total of those 4 petitions was 5,039 signatures. So this was a large national collective action. And the petition asked for the restoration of 25 acres of their reserve land to be restored to them as ancestral land for their community, for their marae and settlement. And the reason why you've got these images here, these come from In Print, don't they? Which is a communist newspaper, workers' newspaper, and many, Te Puea was working and collaborating with kind of unions on support for Ōrākei. So in April 1943, Te Puea went to the settlement to organise working bees, which is what you can see here in the images. And in June, 200 unionists and residents erected a 300-foot palisade around the pa of manuka stakes with tōtara posts embedded in a 2-foot concrete base. They weren't going to get rid of that palisade very easily. And there was also a carved gateway put up too. She was warned at the time by the Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, that if she got involved with the Auckland Trades Council and tried to protect the pa, the police would be sent in and she could end up in prison. Fraser gave in though, recognising the political importance of the Trades Council. This is a Labour government at the time, as well as Te Puea's importance within Māoridom. And he announced in 1943, instead, a proposal to put up houses for Māori residents on the Eastern Plateau to retain the marae on the flat area and work with the City Council to build a new meeting house on the site of the old one. But this was effectively a relocation, and Ngāti Whātua and Te Puea rejected the proposal from Fraser. The petition was a prediction of what would happen only a few years later after the war came to an end. And under a new government, a national government came in 1949, which instructed Māori Affairs to purchase the remaining blocks. And later, when that purchase offer was rejected, they compulsorily acquired the land from Ngāti Whātua in 1951. The community was removed and relocated, and the buildings, including people's homes and the marae, were burnt to the ground so that a new housing area could be set up there, a state housing location. I'm going to talk a bit more about this very soon later. Protecting Ōrākei in 1942 formed the basis of a national collective action, but the community was the location for a series of political mobilizations during the war, often led by women. And as you can see that here in the newspaper article from In Print in 1942, which was an attempt to get a petition going on racial inequality to deal with that in a kind of national collective action led by, I think, Mrs. Otini there. It was also at Aotearoa that the Northern Māori MP launched, Parere Paikea launched the Māori War Effort Organisation, a tribal-based collective supported by the state that mobilised Māori for service overseas and into essential industry in 1942. Aotearoa is kind of a central, location for Māori life on a national scale. It was the beating heart of Māori cultural, political and economic life in Auckland, and its people supported the war effort by welcoming new migrants to the city. Māori support for the war, something that is a form of loyalty that's stressed quite a bit in the petition, was also the basis for seeking redress too. And you probably can't read the petition here very well, but it's made quite clear that loyalty that stretches back to the 1860s as a really important foundation for Aotearoa to be given access to citizenship and their rights. So the price of citizenship was not expressed solely in overseas military service, but also in Māori homes, in communities, on marae, and in the churches on the home front. And what we've talked about just briefly here is just a brief snapshot of what we're hoping to try and flesh out in a bit more detail. The short discussion really covers just a few of the many areas the project will be looking at. And we hope that we've shown that although the war did impact Māori in many ways, neither ordinary life nor ongoing grievances were put on hold during this period. Sometimes we forget that when we see the war as something happening overseas and not at home. Yes, many young Māori men volunteered for overseas service, and men and women worked in towns and cities to undertake essential industry work. But in their Kāinga, missionaries were still active and Māori attended church and they participated in community and cultural activities as they had always done. Similarly, ongoing historical grievances over land did not lie dormant just because there was a war on. Iwi still petitioned Parliament over lands confiscated during the wars of the 1860s and would continue so into the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, and for their Indigenous rights under the Treaty of Waitangi. When the government in 1942 sought to evict Ngāti Whātua from their own land at Aotearoa in Auckland, this was part of an ongoing process that had started 100 years earlier to whittle away the tribal estate. Māori, led by the kingitanga Rangatira Te Puea Hirangi, rallied around to stop that happening at this time. This process did not actually conclude till the late 1980s. When the government proposed to sell the remaining land at Bastion Point for high-income housing in 1977, Ngāti Whātua and their supporters occupied the site for 507 days until forcibly removed by the police. However, this protest stopped the sale and the government eventually returned the land to the tribe in 1988 after a Waitangi Tribunal inquiry. Our examples we've highlighted here show that when it comes to Indigenous histories and experiences of World War II at home, we cannot separate the war years from a longer historical context. Our argument would be that you need to see the war in the context of the 1940s as a whole. But when you're thinking about Indigenous histories, you cannot split the war off, nor those political mobilisations from the stories of the 1860s. And in fact, the past and the present, the past is very much in the present in the 1940s for Māori. So our project is also trying and seeking to bring to light a range of sources, some overlooked, to also foreground Māori voices at this time. Religious ones that often don't get looked at by New Zealand historians very much, or examples from petitions where we have these massive collective actions. So thank you very much for listening to us today. And we hope that you might want to learn a little bit more about our project. And if you do, that you go and have a look at our website, Te Hau Kāinga, which Lockie mentioned is bilingual. And we share that the work that we post on there through Twitter and Facebook as well. So come and join us. And we'd love to have some more followers. It'll be really great. So we're really trying with this project to do both something that's both very local, something that's quite national and connected into a much bigger kind of global story that centres Indigenous perspectives and experiences in a way that is attentive to the needs of whānau at that time and at the present too. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just push all the right buttons while I simultaneously try to thank you. That was fascinating. I've got a lot of questions. I had a look at the website already. I'll take another look the moment I get a chance.
Good.